students, welcome to the second part of chapter 5 friction of class 8 of subject science. Students, earlier you already studied that force of friction between two surfaces in contact depend on the nature of the two surfaces in contact, that is roughness or smoothness of the surfaces. The force of friction is greater where rougher surfaces are involved. The smoother the surfaces, the smaller is the force of friction between them. The force of friction, it mainly depends on the nature of the two surfaces in contact, and second thing, force pressing the two surfaces together. Look at the figure that is given in your screen. There are irregularities. You already know that irregularities are the cause of force of friction that are present on the surfaces of two objects in contact. More is the force applied, more bumps or irregularities they will come closer and they will interlock more strongly with each other. So these are the two factors. One is nature of the surfaces in contact, it means smoothness or roughness of the surfaces, and force pressing the two surfaces. More is the force applied, more will be the force of friction, because irregularities they will interlock with each other with more force, and it will be difficult to unlock them with small force. So more will be the force of friction. Now next topic is types of friction. There are three main types of friction. One is static friction, sliding friction, and rolling friction. Now students, you know that the force of friction is the force exerted by a surface when an object moves across it or makes an effort to move across it. So there are two types of friction. One is static friction and other is sliding friction. First of all, we will study about the static friction. Students, whenever you have to move a heavy object, then what you have to do, you have to apply more force. More force you apply, but the object is unable to move. It means object is also applying force in opposite direction. That force is called force of friction. There is an activity given in your book to understand this. In this activity, what is given? Try to push a large box to make the move across the floor by applying a small force, say F unit. What do we find? The box remains at rest. Whenever you have to move the object, heavy object, then what you do? You apply force and object does not move. Then what you do? Then increase the applied force to 2F unit. Then what do you find out? The box still remain at rest. When external force act on the box, the force of friction known as static friction comes into play and opposes the motion of the box. It means static friction is the friction which comes into play when a force is applied on object and it does not move. Means the force which opposes the movement of object, that is static friction. This static friction balances the force which we exert on the box and the box remain at rest. When applied force is increased to say 2F, it means we double the force. Static friction also increase till the box does not move. It means again the static friction, it is also increased by double, that is 2F, and again opposes the motion of the box. Now increase the applied force gradually till the box just begin to slide over the horizontal surface or floor. So this activity shows that force of static friction increases with increase of applied force. It means static friction is a self-adjusting force, means it adjusts itself by increasing force. With the increase or decrease of force, it adjusts itself. It means it increase or decrease according to the force applied. It can increase only to up to certain limit. The maximum value of the force of static friction comes into play when the body is just sliding over the horizontal surface. It is called limiting force of friction. Limiting force of friction is the force when there is maximum value of force of friction comes into play and object starts moving or sliding on horizontal surface. It means when a force is applied on a body at rest, a force of friction called static friction comes into play. This static friction opposes applied force. On increasing applied force, static friction also increases, but up to certain maximum value. This maximum value of force of static friction is called limiting friction. Now, what is static friction and limiting force of friction? The self-adjusting force of friction that exists between a stationary object and the surface on which it has been kept is called static friction. And what is limiting force of friction? Maximum value of the force of friction between two surfaces in contact with each other that comes into play just before the onset of a relative motion between them is called limiting force of friction. So what we have concluded, if applied force is increased, the frictional force will also increase until it reaches the limiting frictional force. As the applied force increases further, the body will begin to move. The limiting frictional force is independent of the applied force but depends on the nature of surfaces and the normal contact force. Students, now you know that whenever we have to move an object, static friction comes into play. Once the motion gets started, the friction becomes slightly less than the maximum or limiting value of the force of static friction. So, when there is a relative motion between the two surfaces, it starts only when the interlocking between their irregularities have been unlocked. You know that friction is because of irregularities that get locked, that are present on their surfaces. Once motion starts, the irregularities act just as an obstruction against their relative motion. They are not interlocked now. In other words, once the motion starts, the contact points on one surface do not get enough time to lock into the contact points of the other surface. So it is easier to keep on moving an object when it is already in motion than to start it from the rest. Now you have to write answers of the following questions in your rough notebook. Question number 1, mention the factors on which friction depends. Question number 2, define static friction and limiting friction. Question number 3, a box is resting on the floor. To move it, force is applied as shown in diagram. Give value of the force of limiting friction. B, why does the box stay at rest in the cases corresponding to figure A and figure B? C part, mark the direction of frictional force and mention the kind of frictional force that comes into play in each case. That's all for today. Thank you and have a nice